They are the ones who never scream, the ones who smile with precision, who speak in measured tones, who understand everything. When intelligence turns inward, it becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. It doesn't kill quickly, corrodes quietly, slowly. Like acid dripping on marble, it eats through the surface of sanity until nothing remains but the polished echo. Studies show that those with higher IQs are more prone to anxiety, depression, and self-destructive rumination. The very mind that solves complex problems also constructs perfect prisons. But Jung saw this long before neuroscience gave it language. He called it the tyranny of the intellect, the moment when consciousness becomes its own predator. Imagine a man who cannot stop thinking. He lies in bed at night while his brain continues its endless dissection of life. Every memory, every word, every gesture replayed and rearranged like a crime scene. To him, silence is not peace. It's a void filled with whispers he knows too, and yet he feels nothing. That is the curse of the hyper-aware, perception without grounding, intelligence without mercy. I once had a patient who embodied this archetype, a physicist, brilliant beyond measure, but hollowed from within. He described his thoughts as a swarm of knives, always cutting, never resting. He feared stillness because in silence he could hear his own decay. He sought logic to defend against emotion, building walls of reason so high that no light could enter. When I asked him what he feared most, he said, "Feeling something I can't explain." He was not mad. He was lucid, too lucid. His intellect had outgrown his soul. Jung would have called this the victory of logos over eros, the masculine principle of order, devouring the feminine principle of life. Intelligence, detached from instinct, becomes sterile. It observes emotion, like a scientist dissecting a corpse, unaware that it is dissecting itself. Modern neuroscience confirms this. The prefrontal cortex, seat of logic and control, can suppress limbic emotional processing. When this suppression becomes chronic, the result is emotional blunting, a neurological anesthesia. The intelligent mind, in its quest for mastery, silences its own humanity. What begins as clarity ends as numbness. Ancient traditions warned of this long before science could name it. In Buddhist texts, excessive attachment to thought is described as Mara, the illusion that traps the mind in endless analysis. In Christian mysticism, it appears as Lucifer, the light-bringer consumed by his own brilliance. Even in Greek mythology, Prometheus suffers eternal torment for giving too much knowledge to mankind. Every culture intuited the same truth. Light, when hoarded, becomes darkness. The first sign is subtle, fatigue without cause. The mind begins to fold in on itself. The intelligent person starts to feel detached, as though watching life from behind glass. Conversations lose flavor. Music no longer stirs emotion. Beauty becomes data. Then comes the insomnia, the endless turning of thoughts that never rest. The intellect refuses. It believes it can outthink pain. There is a particular cruelty in this destruction because it doesn't look like competent. People admire those composed, articulate, endlessly capable. They do not see the cracks beneath the polish, the overthinking that borders on obsession, the perfectionism that hides terror, the smile that costs too much energy to maintain. The phenomenon evolves in stages. First comes isolation. The intelligent mind feels misunderstood, alienated by its own depth. Then cynicism. Everything appears trivial, meaningless, unworthy of engagement. Finally, despair masked as serenity, a state Jung described as dead calm on the surface of a soul at war. The collapse is silent because noise would betray weakness, and yet there is a way out. But it is not through more thought. Jung said that healing begins when the intellect bows before the unconscious, when reason admits its limits and listens to the whispers beneath the surface. The intelligent person must learn the humility of feeling. It is not a surrender of mind, it is its redemption. In the end, intelligence does not destroy because it is sharp. It destroys because it forgets its purpose. Knowledge without connection becomes entropy. The cure is not ignorance, but integration, the reunion of logic and life, of understanding and awe. When I asked that physicist years later what had changed, he said something that still haunts me. I stopped trying to understand my pain. I started to feel it. He smiled then, not the precise smile of intellect, but the tremor of a man reborn. The silence that once consumed him had become sacred because the mind that once devoured itself had finally remembered. Intelligence was never meant to be a weapon. It was meant to be a mirror. Awareness was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to awaken. But those who see too much too early discover that knowledge is not light, it is fire. And fire, when held too long, burns the one who carries it. Jung warned that consciousness expands faster than the soul can. Awareness tears the veil that protects the psyche from its own abyss. Most people are spared this pain. They live within comforting illusions guided by collective dreams. But the intelligent ones, the deeply aware, are condemned to see through them. They cannot unsee the machinery of deceit, the vanity of ambition, the futility of endless striving. Their gift becomes their punishment. There was a woman once, an artist, devoutly rational yet unbearably sensitive. She came to me describing her awareness as too much light in a small room. Every emotion, every sound, every nuance of expression in others struck her like a physical blow. She saw meanings where others saw habits. She could hear the falseness in laughter, the despair behind smiles. But the more she understood, the more alien she felt. I don't belong anywhere, voice trembling. It's like everyone is asleep, and I'm the only one who woke up too soon. This is the paradox of heightened consciousness. The more we perceive, the less we can belong. Evolution has wired the human mind for survival, not for truth. Those who pierce the illusion of ordinary life often find themselves stranded between worlds, the world of appearances and the world of essence. Jung called this the path of individuation, but he never denied its terror. To see reality stripped of its masks is to witness one's own nakedness. Modern psychology has begun to map what Jung described in metaphysical terms. Studies in cognitive neuroscience show that hyper-awareness correlates with increased activity in the default mode network, the brain system of self-reflection and rumination. This heightened introspection is linked to creativity and intelligence, but also to depression and anxiety. The mind, forced to examine itself endlessly, becomes both the observer and the accused. In ancient texts, this curse of vision was known by other names. In the Old Testament, Adam and Eve's first act of disobedience was not lust or pride. It was awareness. The fruit they ate was not of pleasure, but of perception. They saw what could not be unseen. In Greek myth, Cassandra was blessed with foresight, but cursed never to be believed. And in Buddhist lore, enlightenment is compared to awakening from a dream where others still sleep. To awaken alone is not liberation, it is exile. The signs begin subtly. The intelligent person starts to recoil from crowds. Conversations feel shallow. Small talk feels like sandpaper against the soul. They begin to live inwardly, searching for meaning in silence. But silence turns heavy, filled with echoes of thought. Their empathy becomes painful. Every injustice, every falsehood vibrates in their nerves. Awareness, once beautiful, becomes unbearable. This stage is often mistaken for arrogance. Others accuse them of being aloof, judgmental, cold. But what they call arrogance is exhaustion. The aware individual has seen too much hypocrisy to participate in it. They do not hate others. They are merely haunted by the distance between truth and appearance. Over time, awareness can fragment the psyche. The conscious mind, flooded with stimuli, begins to detach as a defense. The person becomes hypervigilant, analytical, unable to rest. They know every possible consequence, every emotional nuance, every invisible motive. They predict disaster before it arrives, and in doing so, but Jung believed that this curse could become the highest gift if one survives shadow. Awareness is not meant to destroy, but to illuminate the unconscious. The danger arises only when one identifies with mistaking knowledge for wholeness. The intellect believes that if it sees the pattern, it controls it, but the psyche laughs at control. It demands surrender. Awareness without humility is possession. Jung warned of inflation, the state in which the ego identifies with godlike understanding. It believes it stands above others, when in truth it has merely fallen deeper into its own labyrinth. The remedy, paradoxically, is darkness. The individual must descend from the intellect into the body, into emotion, into instinct. Awareness must not hover above life. It must incarnate. There is an ancient story of a monk who prayed for wisdom. The gods granted his wish, but every morning when he awoke, he wept. He saw the suffering of all beings as his own. Finally, he begged the gods to take back his gift. They refused. Instead, they taught him compassion, not as pity, but as endurance. To see, still love, that was the true task. Awareness, when purified by compassion, ceases to be a curse. It becomes vision. The pain remains, but it transforms. The mind that once burned itself becomes a beacon for others, lost in the fog. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The intelligent soul must learn this truth. You cannot think your way out of the abyss you see. You must feel your way through it. Awareness is not the end of suffering. It is the beginning of transformation. When I last saw the artist, she no longer feared her perception. She had learned to let life pass through her, not consume her. I realized, she told me, that light isn't supposed to blind, it's supposed to reveal. And in that moment I understood. Awareness only becomes a curse when it is hoarded. When shared through empathy, it becomes grace. It begins innocently. The intelligent person wants to understand, to organize chaos, to find the pattern that will finally bring peace. But the mind that seeks too much order becomes its own tyrant. What starts as reason becomes ritual, and what begins as logic. Jung warned that overthinking is not intelligence, it is fear wearing them. The overthinker lives in perpetual rehearsal. Every word spoken is replayed, every silence dissected. Their mind is a courtroom, not a judge, where every possibility is evidence against them. Mistake movement for control, analysis for safety. But the truth is cruel. No amount of thought can protect the heart from what it fears most, uncertainty. I once met a man, an engineer whose mind could calculate the weight of a bridge down to the last rivet. Yet he could not cross the bridge of his own emotions. He dissected love as though it were a formula, inspected grief like a faulty mechanism. When his wife died, he didn't cry. He studied her absence like an unsolvable equation. If I can understand it, he said, I can survive it. But understanding did not save him. It built a coffin of concepts around his pain. This is the first stage of overthinking, the illusion of mastery. The intellect believes that by analyzing emotion, it transcends it. But emotions are not equations to be solved. They are storms to be endured. Jung described this state as psychic over-identification with logos, the rational principle. The mind, drunk on its own precision, tries to dominate the irrational currents of life. Yet life cannot be domesticated. Neuroscience confirms this war between thought and being. The overactivation of the prefrontal cortex suppresses the amygdala, muting the emotional signals that give meaning to experience. The result is what researchers call depersonalization, a haunting detachment from self and world. People describe it as living behind glass, observing rather than participating. The overthinker becomes a spectator in their own life, condemned to eternal analysis without immersion. Ancient wisdom warned of this centuries ago. The Stoics cautioned that logic without virtue is arrogant. The Taoists said that the more one tries to control the river, the more violently it resists. And in the Gospel of Matthew, Christ's warning was psychological as much as spiritual. Take no thought for the morrow. Sake. He was not condemning reason, but anxiety disguised as foresight, the sin of trying to outthink existence itself. The signs of overthinking are subtle but unmistakable. The person replays conversations long finished, searching for hidden meaning. They script future encounters, imagining every possible failure. They lie awake while the world sleeps, their mind chewing endlessly on invisible fears. They cannot act because every choice births 1,000 imagined consequences. Decision becomes paralysis. Clarity becomes confinement. Then comes the second stage, fragmentation. The mind splits into voices, each representing a different possibility. What if I'm wrong? What if they misunderstood? What if I fail? These voices are not madness. They are the logical mind devouring itself. Jung called this inflation of consciousness, when thought expands beyond its rightful territory, consuming intuition, instinct, and faith. To escape, the overthinker must descend, not into ignorance, but into humility. They must learn what Jung called symbolic thinking, perceiving life not as data, but as experience, not as problems, but as patterns of meaning. True intelligence does not eliminate mystery, it bows before it. There is a story from the Zen tradition of a scholar who visited a master, boasting of all he had learned. The master poured tea into the scholar's cup until it overflowed. "Why do you keep pouring?" the scholar protested. The master smiled. "Because your mind is like this cup. How can I fill it if it's already full?" Overthinking is the overflowing cup, the mind so flooded with itself that it cannot receive anything new. To be healed, the cup must be emptied. The overthinker must dare to not know. This is not ignorance. It is surrender to the intelligence of the unconscious, the wisdom that breathes beneath words. In modern therapy, mindfulness tries to teach this ancient truth: awareness without judgment. Neuroscience shows that when the analytical brain quiets, other networks activate, the ones linked to creativity, intuition, and compassion. In silence, logic recedes and life whispers its own understanding. I saw this transformation once in the engineer. He began to paint after years of equations. At first, he calculated proportions and symmetry, but slowly the brush began to move without permission. One day he said, "I stopped painting to understand. I started painting to feel." His grief, once measured in theories, began to live again in color. Overthinking is not the presence of too much mind. It is the absence of trust. Trust in the unknown, chaos, in the dark soil where growth hides. Jung said, the greater the intellect, the greater the danger of misusing it. But he also said that in the depths of the irrational lies the source of renewal. Logic must serve life, not rule it. When it rules, it kills. When it serves, it illuminates. The difference is humility, the courage to let go of the illusion that everything can be known. The mind that obsesses over life never truly lives it. But the mind that dares to rest, that allows uncertainty to breathe, begins to glimpse something divine. Peace, not as control, but as communion. Because the ultimate paradox is this: the moment you stop trying to understand everything is the moment you finally understand yourself. There is a moment when the mind no longer analyzes to survive, it analyzes to destroy. A point where awareness, once a gift, becomes a blade turned inward. The intelligent person begins to see not truth, but corruption in every reflection, starting with their own. Jung called this the revolt of the shadow, when consciousness becomes so bright that it blinds itself, forcing the darkness to rise in rebellion. Those who live by the mind often imagine are safe from it. They believe that understanding dissolves suffering, that naming the beast tames it. But the psyche is not an animal to be caged. It is a labyrinth that remembers every step. Intelligence gives the illusion of distance from pain, but sooner or later, the distance collapses. And when it does, the mind becomes a courtroom again, this time with the self on trial. I once treated a philosopher who had devoted his life to ethics. His mind was a cathedral of logic, but beneath the marble floors, a rot. He despised himself for every moment of weakness, every small desire that betrayed his ideals. He called it the sickness of knowing what I am and what I feel. Every insight became poison. Every truth was another nail in his own cross. This is the curse of the intellect turns its precision against the soul, dissecting every impulse until all that remains. Neuroscience gives this torment a modern name: hyper-self-monitoring. Overactivity in the anterior cingulate cortex floods consciousness with error signals, constant alarms that something is wrong, even when life is calm. The mind, unable to rest, hunts flaws like a predator. Ancient wisdom foresaw this pathology long before MRI machines. In Christian theology, it was called the sin of pride, the attempt to be pure through judgment rather than love. In Buddhism, it is the illusion of the hungry ghost, a being that devours itself with endless craving for perfection. In Greek myth, it appears as Narcissus, not in love with his reflection, but trapped by it, unable to look away from his own image until he dies of thirst. The signs unfold quietly. The intelligent person begins to critique their emotions as though they were essays to be graded. Joy feels undeserved. Anger feels primitive. Love feels dangerous. Soon the internal monologue becomes hot. Every mistake echoes louder than compliments sound false, but criticism feels true. The mind that once sought excellence now demands. This is not humility. It is inverted arrogance, the belief that one's flaws are so monumental that they define existence. Jung warned that such individuals mistake their suffering for depth. They confuse self-hatred with honesty. But the truth is simpler and far more tragic. The mind, when denied compassion, becomes addicted to cruelty. In therapy, I often saw how brilliance magnified this cruelty. The more articulate the patient, the more convincing their inner accuser. Intelligence becomes the perfect defense lawyer for self-loathing, producing endless arguments for why forgiveness is impossible. The same analytical precision that could have liberated them becomes the machinery of their own execution. There are, however, moments of revelation, brief fractures in the mirror. One patient, a mathematician, described such a moment after years of silent contempt. I realized that my hatred of myself was just another. If I hate myself, no one else can. Jung would have smiled, for he knew that behind every self-attack's fear, the terror of vulnerability, the refusal to be human. Modern psychology confirms this insight. Research on self-criticism shows its roots in childhood environments where approval was conditional, love earned only through achievement. The adult intellect continues the transaction, replacing parents with an internal tribunal. The smarter the individual, the more elaborate the trial. But the psyche always seeks balance. When contempt reaches its peak, something ancient begins to resist. The unconscious rebels. Nightmares emerge, images of decay, humiliation, collapse. Jung saw these not as pathology, but as messages. The dream reveals what the conscious mind refuses to feel. The more one condemns oneself, the more the shadow demands recognition. Healing begins the moment intelligence stops arguing and starts listening. Jung called this the dialogue with the shadow. It is not confession, but confrontation, meeting the rejected parts of the self with gaze unflinching. The philosopher I mentioned once dreamt he was locked in a cellar with a child covered in. The child stared at him and whispered, "You left me." When he awoke, he wept for the first time in decades. That was the beginning of integration. Compassion is not sentiment. It is the antidote to destruction. The ancient Egyptians called it ma'at, the balance between truth and mercy. Without mercy, truth becomes a weapon. Without truth, mercy becomes denial. The mind must learn both, or it will perish in its own brilliance. Jung wrote, "One does not heal by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. To make darkness conscious is to look into the mirror of self-contempt and refuse to turn away. It is to recognize that even the most intelligent cruelty is still fear disguised as clarity. The mind that attacks itself believes it seeks purity. But purity is not perfect. It is wholeness. And wholeness cannot exist without shadow." When the philosopher finally forgave himself, it was not through logic, but through fatigue. "I grew tired of punishing what I no longer believed was evil." That is how intelligence learns grace. Not by understanding, but by surrendering its need to judge. Because the truest act of intelligence is not knowing everything. It is learning to love what it once condemned. Control is the religion of the intelligent. They worship order as if it were salvation, believing that chaos is a failure of thought. But in the deepest chambers of the psyche, Jung warned that the pursuit of control is never about matter. It is about the fear of dissolution, of surrender, of the unknown forces that dwell in. The more one tries to dominate life, the more imprisoned one becomes by the need to dominate. The mind that must always understand cannot. The heart that must always predict cannot feel. Control is the fortress of those who were once powerless. Behind the walls of rationality, they build a citadel of precision and routine, guarded by the illusion that nothing unexpected can reach them. But the fortress is also a tomb. I once treated a surgeon whose life was a perfect clock, every movement timed, every emotion catalogued, every silence filled with purpose. He believed that discipline was strength, but when his daughter died in an accident he could not prevent, the clock stopped. His precision shattered. He came to me trembling, saying, "If I can't control this, what is the point of anything?" That sentence was not despair, it was awakening. Jung would have called it the collapse of the persona, the mask of control that hides the chaos within. The persona allows us to function, to appear competent, to be admired, but when the mask fuses with the face, the self suffocates. The intelligent, more than anyone, mistake the mask for identity. Their orderliness becomes a performance so seamless they forget it was ever meant to be a role. Modern neuroscience has begun to describe what Jung saw symbolically. The brain's predictive coding system constantly attempts to minimize uncertainty, to control the difference between expectation and reality. The more intelligent and analytical the mind, the more active this system becomes. It anticipates threats, calculates outcomes, simulates the future endlessly. But when life refuses to conform, as it always does, the result is a breakdown, a flood of anxiety, a sense that the universe itself has betrayed reason. Ancient wisdom described this long before science. The Stoics taught that control ends at the boundary of the self. The Taoists spoke of Wu Wei, the power of effortless action, of flow without interference. Christ warned against the delusion of dominion, teaching that whoever seeks to save his life will lose it. These are not moral lessons. They are psychological. Control is death disguised as safety. The signs appear gradually. The intelligent person becomes addicted to planning. Every hour accounted for, every contingency anticipated. Spontaneity feels dangerous. Emotion feels inefficient. When something unexpected happens, a delay, a mistake, a loss, their composure cracks. The world feels hostile, unpredictable. Tighten their grip, unaware that the more they grasp, more life slips through their fingers. This tightening progresses in stages. First comes rigidity, the refusal to adapt, then obsession, the belief that more effort will restore order, finally collapse, when reality's resistance becomes unbearable and the mind breaks under its own architecture. Jung compared this to the myth of Faust, the scholar who trades his soul for mastery, only to discover that control is the most expensive illusion. I remember the surgeon's moment of clarity. It came not in words, but in silence. He sat in my office, hands trembling, saying, "I've spent my whole life cutting open bodies to fix what's broken, but I can't cut open the sky." In that confession, the illusion died. The collapse was not failure, it was freedom. Modern psychology calls this surrender radical acceptance, but Jung understood it as the beginning of individuation, the reconciliation between ego and self. Control belongs to the ego, surrender belongs to the self. Only when the ego bows does transformation begin. There is an ancient parable that captures this truth. A warrior, weary from endless battles, meets a sage by a river. "How do I find peace?" the warrior asks. The sage hands him a cup of water and says, "Hold it still." The warrior grips the cup tightly, but the water spills. "Now try again." The warrior relaxes his hand, and the surface calm. The sage smiles. What you hold too tightly destroy. What you hold gently. Control is the tightening of the hand. Peace is the letting go. The intelligent struggle to understand this because surrender feels like death. But it is only the death of illusion, the end of the false belief that mind can master mystery. The surgeon eventually returned to his differently. He told me, "I no longer operate to prevent death. I operate to serve life." His hands were no less steady, but his heart had changed direction. That is the transformation Jung described. From domination, participate, from ego to essence. Intelligence must learn reverence. The world is not a machine to be commanded, but a living symbol to be entered. Control is not order, it is fear dressed in logic. And fear cannot be mastered by thought. It can only be dissolved. In the end, the mind that seeks to rule everything finds itself enslaved to its own vigilance. The only true mastery is acceptance, the courage to live without guarantees, to walk through chaos without demanding that it bow. Because freedom, Jung wrote, is not found in control. It is found in the moment you realize you never needed it. It is a strange kind of loneliness, the solitude of those who think too deeply to belong. They live among people, yet feel like ghosts. They laugh in the right moments, speak fluently, perform the rituals of connection, but behind their eyes, something watches from a distance. Jung once said that the deeper the soul, the greater the need for solitude, but he also warned that solitude, when prolonged, becomes a wound that festers in silence. The intelligent mind, by its very nature, separates itself. It observes rather than participates. It studies human behavior like an anthropologist among its own species. It sees patterns in everything: power, desire, deception, fear. And this vision, instead of bringing comfort, creates distance. When you see too much, you stop believing in appearances. And when you stop believing, you stop belonging. There was a poet I once knew, a woman whose words seemed to pulse with life. Yet when she spoke of herself, her tone was flat, detached. She confessed that she could describe love in perfect detail, no longer feel it. It's as if I watch myself from outside. I write about warmth, but live in frost. The paradox of intelligence. To understand emotion so thoroughly that it becomes impossible to experience it freely. Neuroscience sheds light on this paradox. Studies show that individuals with high analytical activity in the prefrontal cortex experience reduced limbic reactivity, the part of the brain that processes. In simple terms, the more the mind analyzes, the less the heart feels. This creates an emotional vacuum, kind of cognitive loneliness. The intelligent person becomes both scientist, trapped in observation. Ancient philosophy described this long before modern imaging machines. In the myth of Icarus, the boy flies too high, closer to the sun of knowledge, only to fall when his wings melt. In Buddhist teachings, excessive attachment to thought is the root of suffering. It cuts us off from the web of existence. Even in the Gospels, Christ retreats into the desert, not as escape, but as confrontation. Solitude reveals the abyss. Whether it becomes revelation or ruin depends on the courage to face it. The stages of intellectual isolation are insidious. First comes superiority, subtle, unconscious, born of frustration with superficial minds. Then comes detachment, an inability to connect because connection feels false. Finally comes despair, the realization that intelligence without communion becomes meaningless. Jung saw this in the archetype of the wise old man, the figure of immense knowledge who has no one left to speak to, whose insight becomes a burden instead of a gift. The intelligent isolate themselves not because they despise others, but because they fear being unseen. Their thoughts stretch into places most cannot follow, and so they learn to hide behind irony, detachment, or cynicism. But beneath the mask lies a deeper truth. They are desperate for recognition, not for admiration, but for understanding. I remember the poet's breaking. It came one winter afternoon when she spoke of how success had only deepened her loneliness. People love my words, but they never hear what they mean. Sometimes I wish I could be stupid just to feel close to someone again. Her voice cracked not from shame, but from exhaustion. Intelligence without connection had become a coffin, lined with applause. Jung believed that such loneliness was not a flaw, but a passage. He called it the night sea journey, the descent into the depths where the old self dissolves. Isolation in this is alchemical. It separates the soul from its illusions, forcing it to confront its naked. But if one lingers too long in the depths, the transformation halts. What was meant to purify becomes poison. Modern psychology now recognizes the dangers of this withdrawal. Chronic loneliness increases cortisol, suppresses immunity, accelerates aging. The body itself begins to die of isolation. The mind, in turn, constructs elaborate justification. I don't need anyone. They wouldn't understand. Solitude is strength. But these are defenses, not truths. Even Jung wrote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." Yet roots, no matter how deep, still need light. There is a moment in every intelligent person's journey when they must choose to remain the detached observer or to return to life as a participant. The return is painful. It means vulnerability, misunderstanding, imperfection. But it also means warmth. The poet eventually found her way back, not through philosophy, but through friendship. A small circle of people who didn't understand her mind, but cared for her presence. "They listen," she said softly, "even when I don't make sense." That was enough. The wound of isolation does not heal through more thought. It heals through encounter, through allowing oneself to be seen in all the raw confusion of being human. Jung wrote that individuation was not separation from others, but deeper participation in existence itself. The self is not built in solitude. It is revealed through relationship. In the end, depth is not a prison. It only becomes one when we forget that even the abyss longs for echo. Intelligence must learn to descend and return, to think deeply, but to love simply, because no matter how vast the mind becomes, it will always need another heart to remind it that it is alive. When I last saw the poet, she smiled faintly and said, "I stopped writing about loneliness. I started visiting people instead." Her words were quiet, but behind them the frost had melted, because the deepest wisdom is not what the mind knows, it's what the soul dares. Every structure eventually meets its limit. Even the most brilliant mind, fortified by reason and discipline, will one day tremble under the weight of its own architecture. The collapse of intelligence is not madness, it is metamorphosis. Jung saw it again and again in his patients. The moment when the mind, unable to carry its own perfection, shatters, and something ancient rushes through the crowd. What appears as destruction is often the psyche's final attempt to save itself. Collapse begins quietly, a missed step in the rhythm of thought, a small failure in control. The world grows dim, not from darkness, but from too much light. The overactive mind burns itself, its circuits overloaded by meaning. The person begins to forget why they think, why they strive, why they endure. Depression enters not as an intruder, but as a messenger, an emissary from the unconscious demanding surrender. Jung called it the descent into the underworld, the necessary death before rebirth. I once met a man, a philosopher, whose mind was his empire. He lectured about freedom, reason, and the structure of consciousness. Then, one morning, he couldn't speak. Words, once his instruments, had turned to ash. He sat in his study surrounded by books that no longer meant anything. He described it as the silence after God stops answering. For months he lived in that silence, terrified that his mind had abandoned him. But it hadn't. It was asking to be rebuilt. Modern neuroscience has begun to understand what Jung intuited. When psychological collapse occurs, brain activity between hemispheres becomes desynchronized. The left hemisphere, the domain of logic and language, weakens, while the right, the seat of imagery, intuition, and emotion, floods consciousness. What feels like breakdown is often a neurological rebalancing, the intellect yielding to the archetypal forces it once suppressed. In Jung's language, the ego surrenders to the self. Ancient myths encode this same pattern. In the story of Osiris, the god is torn apart, his body scattered across the Nile. It is Isis, the divine feminine, who gathers his fragments and restores him to wholeness. In alchemy, the nigredo, or black stage, marks the putrefaction of the old self before transmutation begins. In Christianity, resurrection only follows crucifixion. Every culture, in its own tongue, whispers the same truth. The mind must die to be born anew. The stages of collapse unfold with terrifying precision. First comes exhaustion, the body's protest against endless control. Then disorientation, the intellect losing faith in its own power. Then despair, the moment when nothing makes sense and every philosophy tastes of dust. This is the abyss, the psychic void where meaning dissolves. Yet Jung insisted that this void is not chaos, but gestation. The old ego disintegrates so that a larger consciousness may emerge. The philosopher I mentioned eventually stopped reading. He began to walk. Every day he wandered through forests without notebooks or goals. He watched trees, clouds, birds, phenomena that required no analysis. He said that for the first time in decades he felt stupid. In the simplicity of not knowing, he rediscovered presence. The silence that had once terrified him became sacred again. He realized that collapse was not the failure of intellect, but its purification. Psychology today calls this post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where breakdown catalyzes reorganization, producing greater resilience and empathy. But Jung would have said it differently. The self rearranges the psyche when the ego's constructions have outlived their purpose. What we call collapse is the psyche's rebellion against stagnation. The mind breaks so that the soul can breathe. Ancient philosophy understood this rhythm as the dance of opposites. Heraclitus wrote that the way up and the way down are one and the same. The Buddhists call it samsara, the cycle of birth, decay, and renewal. The Taoists call it returning to the source. Jung called it individuation, the journey toward integration, where the fragments of the self are reconciled into wholeness. Collapse is not the end of that journey, it is the crossing into it. But collapse also contains danger. If resisted, it can consume. The intellect, humiliated, tries to reassert control, to rebuild the same fortress that failed. Many do not survive the descent because they mistake it for madness rather than initiation. Jung often reminded his patients, the gods have become diseases. What once were sacred transformations are now pathologized as malfunction. Yet behind every psycho-spiritual crisis lies a buried myth longing to be remembered. The philosopher survived because he did not flee. He let his collapse speak. He said, "It wasn't me who broke, my arrogance." And through that confession, he found humility, not the kind born of defeat, but of reverence. He no longer lectured about freedom. He lived it quietly, imperfectly, humanly. Collapse, when accepted, reveals its hidden beauty. It strips away the counterfeit structures of identity, the illusions of control, the armor of intellect. It leaves only what is real, a trembling consciousness, naked before the mystery of existence. Jung believed that true wholeness begins there, in the ruins of certainty. There is a peculiar grace in falling apart. It is the soul's way of reminding the mind that it was never in charge. The ruins are not punishment. They are invitation to stop seeking answers and start listening, to stop interpreting and start being, because only what breaks can reveal what it was made of. And only the mind that dares to collapse learns that intelligence was never about perfection. It was about becoming whole. Despair is not the absence of hope. It is the exhaustion of meaning. For the intelligent, meaning is their lifeblood. Everything must connect, explain, correspond. But when the web of logic tears, when all the patterns dissolve, something seductive emerges in the void. Jung called it the invitation of the abyss. It is the moment when the intellect, weary of holding the world together, begins to crave annihilation as relief. This attraction to despair is not madness, it is intimacy with the unknown. The deeper one sees into the structure of existence, the more one perceives its fragility. The mind that has touched truth also glimpses its emptiness. And when truth no longer consoles, only darkness feels on. Jung saw this in those who had outgrown naive faith, but had not yet found mature wisdom. They were suspended between worlds, too lucid for illusion, too human for transcendence. I once treated a scientist who spent decades studying the origins of the universe. His brilliance was legendary, his loneliness absolute. One night he told me, the deeper I look into space, the more I feel that it's looking back, indifferent. He had spent his life mapping infinity, only to discover that infinity had no fate. His despair was not born of ignorance, but of comprehension. He had seen too much order to believe in accident and too much chaos. Modern research confirms the paradox Jung intuited. Studies show a correlation, high analytical intelligence and existential depression. The same neural circuits that allow complex reasoning, especially frontal cortex, also enable rumination and metaphysics. The mind designed to solve problems turns on itself when faced with the unsolved. It begins to contemplate its own futility, and in that contemplation finds a strange, perverse peace. Ancient traditions understood this despair as a rite of passage. In the Sufi path, the seeker must pass through fana, the annihilation of the self, before union with the divine. In Christian mysticism, St. John of the Cross called it the dark night of the soul, where faith is stripped of comfort and left naked before God's silence. In Buddhism, enlightenment comes only after the recognition of dukkha, the unbearable truth of suffering. Darkness, in all these paths, is not punishment, but purification. But the modern intellect, cut off from myth, interprets despair as failure. The scientist the philosopher, the artist, all stand before the same silent universe and hear nothing. In that silence, the temptation whispers, if meaning is gone, why continue? Yet Jung warned that this whisper is not the call of death. It is the voice of transformation misunderstood. Despair is the soul's way of withdrawing energy from old idols so that it may redirect it toward the new. The stages of this seduction unfold like a slow poison. First comes a subtle emptiness behind every achievement, then cynicism, the conviction that nothing matters, then the abyss itself, where even self-preservation feels optional. Jung described this as psychic regression, the ego dissolving into the collective unconscious. If resisted, it becomes pathology. If endured, initiation. The difference lies not in pain, but in meaning. I remember the night the scientist finally broke. He confessed, "I don't want to die. I just want everything to stop." There was no drama in his voice, only clarity. I told him, "Then let it stop. Stop knowing. Stop seeking. Let the silence be what it is." He looked at me as though I had uttered blasphemy, but he did it. He allowed the void to exist without trying to explain it. Weeks later, he described something extraordinary. The silence didn't kill me, it began to speak. This is the paradox Jung lived by. The psyche renews itself through despair. What the ego experiences as annihilation, the soul experiences as rebirth. Modern psychodynamic studies echo this. Those who pass through existential depression often emerge with greater compassion, creativity, and spiritual depth. The collapse of meaning becomes the ground for authentic meaning. In mythic terms, this is the descent of Persephone into Hades, the winter of the spirit before the return of spring. Despair is the underworld's invitation. It asks not for resistance, for presence, to feel the weight of non-existence without fleeing. Because only by touching nothingness can one understand the value of being. But darkness seduces not just with pain, but with clarity. It promises a world stripped of illusions, where everything false burns away. That is its danger. To stay too long in despair is to confuse clarity. Jung insisted that the key to survival is relationship, to others, to nature, to the sacred. Connection anchors the soul while it crosses. When the scientist finally returned to his observatory, he no longer sought design in the stars. He simply watched them. They're not cold anymore, they just are. That quiet acceptance is what Jung called the reconciliation of opposites. The union of knowing and unknowing, of light. Despair seduces because it offers truth without comfort. But if one listens carefully, beneath its silence, there is the pulse of something vast, impersonal yet profoundly alive. The mind that can bear that silence without fleeing does not remain the same. It becomes larger, deeper, freer. Because to descend into despair and return is to know that even in the absence of meaning, life itself remains the greatest mystery of all, and that paradoxically is meaning enough. Pain is the oldest teacher of the human psyche. It speaks a language older than words, older than thought itself. Before philosophy, before science, before even the first prayer whispered into the dark, there was pain, and through it, transformation. Jung understood this not as cruelty, but as necessity. He wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." The mind resists this truth, but the soul knows it. What the intellect rejects, the heart must endure. For the intelligent, suffering is especially corrosive because it cannot be rationalized away. They try to decode it, to measure its cause, to trace its pattern. But pain does not answer logic, it dissolves it. The more one analyzes suffering, the deeper it cuts. For pain is not a problem to be solved, it is an element to be survived, the furnace through which the raw ore of being is gold. I once worked with a pianist whose hands trembled after years of every note, once flawless now, came with hesitation. He loathed himself for it. Music had been his proof of worth. Now it betrayed him. "Why would life take from me the only thing I love?" he asked. But life was not taking, it was tempering. Jung would have called it the alchemical nigredo, the blackening phase, where everything familiar decays so that something eternal can be born. Neuroscience confirms what myth and mysticism have long intuited. In controlled studies, emotional pain activates the same neural circuits as physical injury. The brain does not distinguish between a broken heart and a broken bone. Yet, paradoxically, Repeated exposure to suffering, when endured consciously, reshapes these networks. It strengthens resilience, empathy, and self-regulation. The same pathways that once carried agony begin to carry wisdom. The crucible of pain is not merely metaphorical, it is biological. Ancient traditions saw this process as divine metallurgy. In Sumerian myth, the goddess Inanna descends into the underworld, stripped of her garments and power, only to emerge transformed. In Christian theology, Christ's suffering is not punishment, but purification, the archetypal passage through death into rebirth. In Buddhist philosophy, dukkha is not to be eliminated, but understood. Through suffering, one awakens to impermanence and compassion. Each system, in its own way, encodes the same law. The soul evolves through friction. The stages of psychological alchemy mirror this descent. First comes denial, the refusal to accept that suffering has meaning. Then rebellion, the ego's rage against what it cannot control. Then despair, the death of the illusion that life must be fair. And finally surrender, not resignation, but transmutation. Jung called this the turning of lead into gold, the moment when the pain itself becomes consciousness. The pianist's transformation began when he stopped fighting his trembling. One day he sat at the piano and let his imperfection breathe. The melody that emerged was fractured, hesitant, yet alive. He wept while playing, not from grief, but from relief. I've been chasing perfection, but all I ever wanted was to feel. In that moment, his suffering ceased to be an enemy. It became his instrument. Modern psychology recognizes this as post-traumatic growth. Yet Jung saw something. He believed pain was not merely to be overcome, but integrated. Each wound, if faced without denial, reveals an aspect of the self. What we call trauma is the psyche's attempt to expand faster than the ego can comprehend. Healing is not the restoration of what was lost. It is the birth of what never existed before. In the alchemical texts Jung loved, suffering is symbolized by fire. Fire does not negotiate, it consumes. Yet within the flames, impurities burn away, and what survives emerges unrecognizable, purer, stronger, real. This is why the ancients revered the phoenix. It dies in agony, but from its ashes, wings emerge anew. Every psychological is a phoenix moment, disguised as despair. But suffering is also seductive. Once we find meaning in it, we risk clinging to. Some intelligent souls turn pain into identity, mistaking depth for endless sorrow. Jung warned of this shadow, the martyr complex, where one refuses healing for fear of losing significance. The task let pain transform, not the fire must be walked through, not lived in. There is a story of a monk who asked his teacher how to escape pain. The teacher placed his hand into the fire and said, "Do not escape, burn completely." The monk wept. Years later he understood. Pain ends not when it disappears, but when it has nothing left to teach. The pianist later wrote a composition called Ashes and Silence. It was not grand, not virtuosic, but hauntingly alive. When I asked what it meant, he said, "It's the sound of what remains after I stopped resisting." That is the essence of Jung's alchemy, the art of turning suffering into soul. Pain refines intelligence into wisdom, ego into empathy, knowledge into presence. It strips away illusion until only the essential remains, because in the end, pain is not the opposite of peace. It is the path to it. The fire that destroys is the same that illuminates, and those who learn to walk through it emerge not smarter, but whole. There comes a moment when the mind, exhausted from its endless battle with existence, stops fighting. It falls silent, not in defeat but in revelation. The collapse, despair, the pain, all led to this single turning point. The awakening of the self is not an achievement, it is a remembering. It is the realization that beneath all the intellect, behind all the logic and control, something eternal has been waiting patiently for the mind to rest. Jung called it the union of opposites, the sacred marriage between consciousness and the unconscious, between the thinker and the life that thinks through him. The intelligent soul spends a lifetime constructing meaning. They climb mountains of thought, build towers of reason, decipher the patterns of the universe, all in search of understanding. But the more they seek, the more elusive truth becomes, because truth is not something the mind can possess. It is something it must surrender to. The awakening begins the moment intelligence admits its own limits, the moment knowledge bows to mystery. I once met a scholar whose brilliance terrified. He could quote Jung, Nietzsche, and every philosopher who ever questioned the nature of being, yet his eyes were hollow. "I understand everything," he said, "and it means nothing." He had reached the edge of intellect's kingdom, where words end and silence begins. I asked him, "When was the last time you felt awe?" He paused, as if the word itself were foreign. Then he whispered, "I can't remember." Come. This is the threshold Jung spoke of, the desert of meaning where the ego dies of thirst so that the soul can drink. Modern neuroscience calls it a state of quiet coherence, where activity in the prefrontal cortex decreases and the brain enters synchrony. Mystics would call it grace. To the rational mind, it feels like surrender, but to the self, it feels like home. Ancient wisdom describes this state in every language of transcendence. In the Upanishads, it is Atman, realizing it is Brahman, the drop remembering it is the ocean. In Taoism, it is Wu Wei, effortless being. In Christian mysticism, it is the moment Christ says, "Not my will, but thine." In Jungian language, it is individuation, the completion of the journey through shadow, control, collapse, and suffering into integration. The signs of awakening are subtle. The intelligent person no longer obsesses over meaning, yet everything becomes meaningful. They no longer demand control, yet life begins to flow effortless. They stop analyzing emotions and start inhabiting them. Time slows, small things, the rustle of leaves, the tremor of breath, the warmth of light on skin. Awareness, sharp and restless, softens into presence. The scholar I mentioned once described his awakening in a single sentence. One morning, he said, "I stopped asking what life meant and started feeling that it was enough." His mind had not grown dull, it had become transparent. Knowledge was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a lens through which he saw the divine symmetry of being. He smiled when he said, "I think I finally understand what Jung meant when he said the soul is not a problem to be solved, but a living mystery to be experienced." Modern psychology echoes this in what it calls self-transcendence, the state where personal identity expands to include others, nature, and the cosmos itself. It is measurable in the brain as increased connectivity across regions responsible for empathy and introspection, but no scan can capture it. Because the awakening of the self is not a neurological event, it is a sacred remembering, the realization that consciousness is not in the mind is in consciousness. Jung often spoke of the self as a mandala, a circle containing all light and shadow, reason and instinct, life and death. The awakening is the moment the mind recognizes it was never separate from that whole. Every mistake, every failure, every descent into darkness becomes part of a larger pattern of becoming. Even suffering, once cursed, is revealed as sacred architecture. There is a story from Zen about a monk who asked his master, "What is enlightenment?" The master replied, "When I am hungry, I eat. When I am tired, I sleep." The monk protested, "But everyone does that." The master smiled, "Not like this. For the awakened, ordinary life is no longer ordinary. Every act becomes prayer. Every breath participation in eternity." The intelligent often imagine awakening as illumination, a blinding flash of revelation. But Jung knew it is quieter, humbler. It is the slow dawning that the light we sought outside was never absent within. The awakening is not about becoming divine. It is about remembering we always were. The final stage of this transformation is service. The awakened intelligence no longer seeks validation or victory. It turns outward, not from duty, but from compassion. Having walked through its own shadow, it recognizes the pain of others as its own. Jung called this the path of the wounded healer, the soul that transforms its suffering into guidance for the collective. The scholar I once knew now teaches differently. He begins each lecture with silence. Not to think, he says, but to listen. His students describe something ineffable in those moments, as if the room itself were breathing. Understanding is not the goal, presence is. This is the ultimate paradox of Jung's vision, that the most intelligent act the mind can perform is to dissolve into awareness itself, to realize that intelligence, for all its brilliance, was only the bridge, the soul was the destiny. In the end, awakening is not a victory march. It is a quiet homecoming, the return to what was always there, beneath all the theories, beneath all the striving, the silent intelligence of existence itself. And if there is one truth that remains after all the searching, all the collapsing, all the burning, it is this: the mind is not meant to conquer life. It is meant to witness it, and in that witnessing at last, intelligence meets soul.